So as far as I'm concerned, the whole thing has collapsed. Initially, the Democrats were talking about bribery. Bribery is not in either one of the two articles of impeachment. Then they talked about quid pro quo, that's not there. They talked about extortion, that's not there. So they keep moving the goalposts to try and find some basis to get rid of Trump. Because in my opinion, as simplistic as it sounds, they hate his guts. Look at the impeachment inquiry vote for Richard Nixon. It was 410-4 to authorize an impeachment investigation. For Bill Clinton, 35 Democrats, I think it was, joined with the Republicans to authorize an impeachment inquiry into Bill Clinton. Not a single Republican voted to authorize an impeachment inquiry into Donald Trump. Not any. It is by far the most one-sided partisan impeachment inquiry in American history.
In the eyes of radio talk show personality Larry Elder, does the Horowitz IG report on FISA abuse possibly vindicate the FBI, as some have been suggesting? Why does Larry think that the Democrat-led Trump impeachment efforts are likely to backfire, hurting the Democratic Party more than helping? What's his take on the unusual articles of impeachment that were drafted? And how, in Larry's eyes, does identity politics play a role in media underreporting of anti-Semitism in the United States? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jekielek. In this episode, we'll sit down again with radio personality and best-selling author Larry Elder, who hosts The Larry Elder Show for the Epoch Times. We discuss the IG report, the Trump impeachment inquiry, identity politics, and how it plays into knee-jerk assumptions about the identities of the suspects involved in the recent kosher market shooting in New Jersey.
Larry Elder, it's really great to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you. I think it's number 3, isn't it?
I think it's
Three
number 3. I think we also announced your new show,
right?
Which I've been loving a couple of times a week.
Thank you.
It's been wonderful.
It's been good.
It's a couple of times a week now.
We do
right?
it twice a week now,
yeah.
And we're going to gear up to 3 times a week pretty soon.
Fantastic. No, I mean these little interludes. It's just 10 or 12 minutes. I love it.
I've been enjoying the comments.
Yeah.
And somebody wrote, "Who writes all these things?" I do. and we have a gentleman named Hal who edits it, and we have a gentleman named Key who films it. And so it's a collaborative effort of the 3 of us.
No, and I recommend everyone watching right now to check it out. It's fantastic. So Larry, the IG report just came out recently. People have been poring over it.
Right.
There were some immediate quick reactions. Some of them were surprising, at least to me. One of them was the past director, James Comey, basically saying he felt the report vindicates him. Another one was that, essentially the president and the William Barr, they owe the FBI an apology. That's not what our analysts have been seeing. That's what I've been seeing. What's your reaction?
Well, I think the reaction to the IG report is in the eye of the beholder. This country is polarized down political lines. Half the country wants him impeached. Half the country does not want him impeached. So I think that how you feel about Trump and how you feel about impeachment will determine how you feel about the IG report. But the IG report made basically 3 findings, in my opinion. The first one is that there were, in fact, all sorts of errors and omissions in the application to get the warrant to surveil Carter Page, the Donald Trump aide. That's very critical. He also said, Michael Horowitz did, that dossier that's been controversial was central in getting the FISA warrant. Without the dossier, no FISA warrant. That is completely inconsistent with what James Comey said. James Comey has publicly said that the dossier was not central to getting the application. That was refuted by IG Horowitz. Furthermore, the idea that Comey feels vindicated is refuted by the very words of Michael Horowitz himself. He said this report doesn't vindicate anybody. The second finding is that the investigation into Russia interference was a legitimate investigation, and so therefore when Trump calls it a witch hunt, that's invalid. And the third one is that he felt that the investigators had no political bias, notwithstanding their comments that were made by some of these investigators about Trump should lose $100 million to nothing. We're going to have an insurance policy to make sure he doesn't get elected, all that stuff. As far as Michael Horowitz was concerned, that did not suggest a political bias. Now, it's very important. He said there was no evidence of political bias, but he also did not say that there was no evidence that there wasn't political bias. He said we didn't reach a conclusion on this particular issue.
Right.
So, as far as Larry Elder is concerned, the IG report suggests that Donald Trump and his defenders were right in attacking this process. Were right in saying that the dossier was very important, but for the dossier, there would not have been a warrant to surveil the campaign aid. So as far as I'm concerned, the IG report does not at all suggest that this president should be impeached. Impeachment, as you know, is a political question, not just a legal question. But most presidents, the presidents in the past who have been impeached, have committed a crime. Richard Nixon was on tape literally instructing aides to lie under oath. That's called subornation of perjury. Bill Clinton perjured himself, and he pleaded guilty to perjury, lost his law license. Donald Trump has not perjured himself. The four witnesses were specifically asked, has he committed a crime? Did he bribe anybody? No. Did you see a crime? No. Was there quid pro quo? The only one who said so was Ambassador Sondland, and he said he added 2 + 2 = 4, and he assumed that the president was offering a quid pro quo. More importantly, Sondland said that he took aside the top aide to the Ukraine president and told him that President Trump said, hey, if you don't announce an investigation into the Bidens, we're going to hold up this money. Well, that aide just the other day said publicly, there was no such conversation. I was never alone with Gordon Sondland. We never had that conversation. I have no idea what he's talking about. I never felt pressured. The president of Ukraine said he never felt pressured. And by the way, the money was never held up and there was no announcement. I asked my friends who are on the other side the following question. Does this pass the shoe on the other foot test? Let's assume that Barack Obama, at 90% popularity rating on the part of Democrats, did exactly the same thing that people are accusing President Trump of doing. On a conversation, he said to a foreign counterpart, do us a favor because we've gone through a lot. Will you look into this? Because there's a son of Mitt Romney who's on a board, and we feel that there's some shenanigans going on here. Would you look into that? Let's assume the very same thing that Trump is accused of doing, Barack Obama did. Do you believe the Democrats would be saying he needs to be impeached? Or would they be talking about the wonderful economy, first black president, he's been appointing judges that we like, he's been doing what we like on the borders, he's been doing what we like on health care? That's exactly what they were saying. So it doesn't even pass the shoe on the other foot test.
So Larry, you're basically connecting, the Russia probe, which then ended up in this FISA investigation, which ended up with this IG report, and the impeachment. You feel it's like part of the same.
Well, yeah, they're impeaching him because of his interaction with the president of Ukraine. This is what this thing is all about. And speaking of that, when did the Trump haters become so pro-Russia? When Obama came into office, one of the first things he did was to renege on a deal that George W. Bush had negotiated with the Poles and the Czech Republic for missile defense. Russia didn't like it, and what Obama wanted to do was to placate Russia because he wanted Russia's help in doing this Iran deal. Also, we have Obama on a hot mic saying to Medvedev, the then head of the Soviet Union, a Putin puppet, I'll have more flexibility after the election. When Mitt Romney in 2012 was debating Obama, Romney and Obama were asked to name the top geopolitical threat in the country, in the world. And Mitt Romney said Russia. And Obama scoffed at it and said the 80s had just called, they want their foreign policy back. It was Hillary, his Secretary of State, who when he first came into office pushed the so-called reset button with her counterpart to change the terms of our relationship with Russia because Obama felt that George W. Bush was too hawkish towards Russia. So I'm trying to figure out when all of a sudden the Democrat became such a good friend of Russia. It was Trump who supplied lethal weapons to the Ukrainians. Obama was asked to do that and didn't do it. So I just really think this whole thing is all political. The Democrats never gave a rip about Russia and about Russian aggression. They were, in fact, feeling that George W. Bush was way too militaristic towards Russia, and they wanted to reverse that. So Trump comes in, and he wants to have a good relationship with Putin, and now all of a sudden he's Putin's butt boy? It's just so incredibly unfair.
Larry, what do you make of these articles of impeachment?
Well, there were 4 that we thought they were going to have. And then they got down to 2. Apparently Lawrence Tribe, the professor from Harvard, told the Democrats that there's no way you can argue that this is a bribe. So they don't use the word bribe anymore, even though they were arguing bribe for some time. It's called abuse of power, which is very vague, and the other one is obstruction of Congress. Essentially, I guess what they're saying is if you're the president and you're asked to supply a witness or they subpoena documents and you don't feel there's a basis for that and you challenge that in court, you are somehow obstructing Congress. If that's true, then Obama should have been impeached for obstructing Congress. Because during Fast and Furious, documents were subpoenaed. The AG, Eric Holder, did not turn over those documents and became the first, and to my knowledge, the only AG to ever be found in criminal contempt of criminal contempt of Congress for failing to turn over the documents. They were ultimately turned over, but not for several years. So if simply resisting what you feel is an unfair or unwarranted request for documents or for a witness constitutes obstruction of Congress, then virtually every president has committed obstruction of Congress. It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous.
And what about the abuse of power article?
Again, I thought the whole point was that Donald Trump was shaking down Ukraine to get them to make some announcement about an investigation into Hunter Biden. It was a quid pro quo or a bribe or an extortion. Those words do not appear in that article. It's very vague, and as far as I'm concerned, it's written that way so that a Democrat can put into anything he or she wants. I've heard discussion during the impeachment inquiry debate over Donald Trump's racism, over Donald Trump's language, over his treatment. This is a very, very low bar and a very sloppy and a loose standard. And the Democrats should be forewarned the next time one of their guys is in office and there's a political dispute, that person could be impeached as well.
So, well, this is sort of the question, right? I guess you're arguing that it's becoming nakedly political, as a nakedly political tool.
That's exactly my argument. My argument is this is 100% political. When not a single Republican joins with the impeachment inquiry, that's a problem, especially when in 1998, Nancy Pelosi, in defending Bill Clinton against impeachment, said that this needs to be bipartisan. It's not bipartisan. Jerry Nadler, who's now the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, made the same assertion. And in recent months, Nancy Pelosi publicly said, unless there's substantial bipartisan support for impeachment, we ought not have it. She's been pressured, in my opinion, by the progressive wing of her party, the squad plus one. The plus one is Al Sharpton, into doing this. I think Nancy Pelosi was dragged into doing this kicking and screaming, and the polls might show that she was right. The polls are now showing the support for impeachment is diminishing, and the approval for Donald Trump is increasing, and especially in these so-called swing states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. There was just a Monmouth poll, and Donald Trump is now ahead of all of his likely rivals in all those states, largely because of this impeachment business. It's not working. It's going to backfire on the Democrats, and there are about 31 Democrats who were elected in 2018 in districts that Donald Trump won in 2016. These are the so-called swing districts. And they're going to go home this weekend and talk to their constituents, and they're going to hear an earful. And I think you're going to be surprised at how many Democrats defect from the leadership and vote against these articles of impeachment. Not enough to stop it, but I think it's going to be about 10 maybe congresspersons on the Democratic side who vote against these two articles. You need about 18 to stop it, so we're not going to get to that point. But there are going to be a substantial number of Democrats who are going to hear an earful from their constituents who do not want this impeachment thing.
So Larry, this reminds me actually, I saw this kind of video posted on Twitter just showing, I guess, what was happening during the opening statements of the impeachment hearings. There was, kind of wall-to-wall coverage of all the Democratic statements, so to speak, and then subsequently it also showed the opening statements for the IG Horowitz testifying to the Senate being essentially the opening statements of that being kind of completely omitted. This is off of CNN. Of course, the allegation being there's media bias at play here, mm-hmm. and so forth. I know this is something that you watch closely. How do you see it?
Well, the media have been against Donald Trump from the very beginning. CNN in particular. There's something called Project Veritas, and they filmed an individual who became disgruntled having worked at CNN because of their bias, and he agreed to wear a wire and tape people. And this individual shows Jeff Zucker, the CEO of CNN, literally every morning dictating to his flock on what they ought to be doing. And one of the employees at CNN says that Jeff Zucker, the CEO of CNN, has a vendetta against Donald Trump and hates him, and every morning tells us effing what to talk about to the exclusion of other issues that we think are more important. So that's where CNN is. It's interesting, when the whistleblower story first broke, One of their intel analysts is a guy named Phil Mudd. Phil Mudd used to work for the FBI and the CIA.
Okay.
And my feeling is they hadn't had time to coordinate what kind of response they wanted to have to this whistleblower complaint on the part of all the CNN analysts. And Phil Mudd went off on not the president, but on the whistleblower, and said, I was in the White House, I used to listen to phone calls. How dare someone not like what the president says and then go public with it? The president should be able to say whatever he wants to a foreign counterpart without somebody on the phone call divulging what he said. And Chris Cuomo, who was the host, who hates Donald Trump too, was shocked at this guy's reaction. I did not see Phil Mudd on CNN for weeks after that. And I watch a lot of CNN. I'm not saying he never showed up, but he was on regularly until he said what I just now said he said. And all of a sudden, you don't see him very much anymore. James Clapper also appeared on CNN. James Clapper was a former national intelligence director of Barack Obama. And James Clapper publicly said that the dossier was minor in getting the FISA warrant. It didn't really matter that much.
Right.
That is completely refuted by what the IG, Michael Horowitz, said. So you have much of the media, I call it the left stream media, disliking Donald Trump from the very beginning. And speaking of disliking him from the very beginning, let's talk about what he's gone through since he's been in office for 3 years. After he wins the election, the next day, there's an op-ed piece in the Washington Post by John Podesta, Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, and he says effectively that the electors ought not seat Donald Trump because of the Russian interference, and he urged President Barack Obama to conduct hearings into the degree to which Russia interfered before we determined that Donald Trump was a legitimate president of the United States. And I know an elector in Michigan who told me he got all sorts of phone calls from people urging him not to certify the election for Donald Trump. Okay, the election is certified, Donald Trump becomes the next president of the United States. 25% of the Democrats refused to attend his inaugural. I asked you what would have happened had 25% of Republicans not attended the inaugural of Barack Obama, because after all, Obama was trashing the Iraq War that Republicans supported. Obama wants Obamacare that nobody wanted. So there were some major policy differences that Obama campaigned on and got elected on that Republicans resented. So one could make a case that I shouldn't attend the inaugural, somebody's going to change the country so dramatically, but of course all the Republicans showed up. President Trump's first State of the Union speech, there were a dozen Democrats who didn't show up for that. And then there was the attempt to invoke the 25th Amendment on the grounds that President Trump was emotionally and physically and mentally unfit to exercise the duties and responsibilities of his office. There was a bill introduced for that by Jackie Spear, a congressman from California. That's why President Trump put on his doctor, who had that press conference, to say he was fit as a horse. He only gets about 4 or 5 hours of sleep, but he can do it. And then, of course, 2.5 years investigating Russia collusion. There was an allegation that he had violated campaign finance laws with his payments to former mistresses. There was an allegation that he violated the emoluments clause. In fact, that's AOC's #1 reason for wanting to impeach the president. And now we have this whistleblower nonsense. So from the very beginning, the president has been under siege by the Democrats. They try to find all sorts of reasons to impeach him. Al Green, a Democrat from Texas, wants him impeached because of his statement about S-hole countries. Are you kidding me? So it's hard to take this thing seriously when from day one there's been one attempt after another to delegitimize this president and to get him to leave office. He's not going to. He's going to get reelected, and Nancy Pelosi's instincts, I think, are going to be proved to be right, that the country is going to have a backlash against this attempt to get rid of this guy.
You know, speaking of these, I guess, attempts to delegitimize the president, I think the Steele dossier, you know, was kind of an egregious example of this. As we mentioned, I think earlier, unverified. It's been sort of documented extensively now in the IG report how
right.
This is just, and I don't know, illegitimate isn't the right word, but
and by
unverified.
By the way, Jan, many of the reporters we talk about have been saying over the last several months that the Steele dossier had been verified. Said it over and over again, and as you know, it's not been verified. Just the opposite.
Yeah, and I'm waiting for the retractions around
right.
But seriously, because now I think the one thing it seems to me everyone's agreeing on is that what IG Horowitz said is legitimate, and everyone should accept, which is great. I think there's a lot of good material in this report. But one of the things is Steele dossier is just simply not something that is in any way verifiable or usable as intelligence.
And critical in getting the warrant to surveil Carter Page.
Absolutely.
That's what's important, because James Clapper and James Comey have both said that the dossier was not important at all in getting the warrant. That's been refuted by the IG. So a lot of people should be apologizing for a lot of things. The president did say, do us a favor, because we've been through a lot. That's what this whole thing turns on, the idea that the president pressured Ukraine into announcing a public investigation into the Bidens. The problem with that is the president of Ukraine said he felt no pressure. The top aide, the man that Ambassador Gordon Sondland, the ambassador to Ukraine, claims he pulled aside and told about this deal, said that conversation never took place. No one ever told me that the money was being held up because of this. We knew the money was being held up. We didn't know the reason. The money was released, and nobody ever made any kind of announcement of any kind of investigation. And so you're impeaching the president for pressuring a country to make an investigation, make an announcement that they didn't make, because you were going to withhold money that you didn't withhold. I just think that the country would be on fire if Republicans pulled this same stunt on Obama, if Obama had done exactly the same thing. Country would be on fire.
So now that we've jumped back to the impeachment question, you said you're expecting it to pass, even though there will be some Democratic defections.
Right.
Now, it's in front of the Senate. People have said it's unlikely to pass there. What are your expectations?
Dead on arrival. Getting back to the House, probably the most wobbly Republican is a guy named Will Hurd. Will Hurd is a Texas Republican who, by the way, is not going to run for re-election. So he's a lame duck. He was very critical of the phone call, thought it was improper, but does not feel it rises to the level of impeachment. You can't get a guy who's a lame duck who can make a conscious vote if he wants to vote for impeachment on the Republican side. You're not getting anybody. On the Senate, I can't imagine a single Republican senator, including Mitt Romney, voting for the expulsion of the president, because this is really a trial. The House indicts the president essentially, and the Senate will then try the president. The president says he wants a trial. He wants to put on Hunter Biden. He wants to put on the so-called whistleblower as soon as we can find him or her on. He wants to put on Ambassador Sondland. He wants to have a trial. I don't think the Republicans do. I don't think Mitch McConnell does. I think Mitch McConnell is going to make a motion to dismiss. There'll be a majority vote, and that'll be that. But Trump claims he wants to have a trial and claims he wants to testify. I don't think any lawyer worth his salt would allow his client to testify like that. So I doubt that that's going to happen. So it's going to be very quick in the Senate, and it's going to be dismissed, or it should be.
So Larry, something that just struck me, is that with the IG report coming out, for the people that actually, read it in its entirety, or basically saw this FISA abuse being kind of laid plain, and listened to the IG Horowitz actually testifying on all these issues. I'm wondering to myself if that doesn't kind of solidify this case that you were making earlier, which is just that there's been this sort of perpetual attempt to delegitimize the president, remove the president, and so forth. Like, if you weren't sure before the IG report came out,
right,
maybe now you're a lot more sure. Is that?
Well, I think a fair-minded person, if we can find such a person in this country, would look at this whole thing and say, this does not amount to the level of throwing a president out of office. You can make an argument at best that the phone call was ambiguous. I think that's what Jonathan Turley said. Jonathan Turley was one of the 4 lawyers who testified. 3 of the lawyers testified that Donald Trump had committed an impeachable act in the phone call. And he said, at best, that phone call is ambiguous because Trump says, do us a favor, the country has been through a lot, and then talks about other things. And so as far as he's concerned, the evidence is not there to establish some sort of demand, pressure, quid pro quo, bribery, or extortion. And those are the words Democrats used to use, until Lawrence Tribe, the Harvard lawyer who's been advising them, told them that the evidence does not support a bribery charge. And that's when they reverted to a more ambiguous and vague abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. So I think the average person who's got a job and a family and a dog is looking at this thing and going, I don't get it. And if you look at the independents, and that's where this thing is imploding, there's been a sharp decrease in independent support for impeachment. So I think when these congresspersons go back to their districts, the 31 or so that have won in districts that Trump won in 2016, they're going to get an earful.
So, okay, let's say this plays out as you say, that basically this thing is dead on arrival in the Senate. And what can you foresee the next steps? Is there going to be another attempt to somehow delegitimize the president, or is it going to be actually case closed, or what's going to happen?
If the president gets reelected, this kind of vendetta against him will continue. Al Green is a Democrat from Texas. He's already said the president can be impeached more than one time. If we don't get him this time, we can get him another time. And this is the guy who wants the president impeached because of his statements regarding race. Al Green recently said the president, when he came down the escalator, referred to countries as S-hole countries. Well, the president came down the escalator in 2015. The S-hole country remark wasn't made until 2018, so he's off by about 3 years. I mean, that's how rabid and almost pathological the hatred toward Donald Trump is by some of these Democrats.
So, we're talking about the election. There's the Democratic field has, narrowed somewhat. And this is something.
I'm not sure it has. A couple of people jumped in. Bloomberg and Patrick Duvall jumped in. So for everyone that's jumped out, you have more jumping in.
Well, so something that you talk a lot about, Larry, is this kind of realm of identity politics,
right?
And, how this is, I guess, a central theme of certainly the discussions and the debates around the Democratic field. Mm-hmm. And now we're left with an all-white cast, and there's a lot of commentary on that, right?
Well, I guess I have a lot of things to say about that. First of all, the Democrats in general are all about racism, racism, racism. That's one of the things that drives the party, because they need that 95% near monolithic black vote without which they can't win. And so to tell black people that they're being subjected by institutional racism, systemic racism, or structural racism is just Democratic politics 101. Beto O'Rourke, during the primary season before he dropped out, said that blacks are victims of enduring fundamental racism. I never really heard anybody put it that way, enduring fundamental racism. And I was looking at the debate stage. To his left was Andrew Yang of Chinese extraction. To his right was Cory Booker, who's black. Kamala Harris was on the stage. Her father is from Jamaica, her mother is from India. Tulsi Gabbard is a Samoan American. Why didn't enduring and foundational racism stop those people from being on the very same stage, the very same night, competing for the very same job, as was Beto O'Rourke? It's ridiculous. This is what they do. Now, more white rivals have dropped out than any other category since this thing has started. Steve Bullock dropped out. John Hickenlooper, the former governor of Colorado, dropped out. A guy named Sestak dropped out. Beto O'Rourke dropped out. Eric Swalwell dropped out. Gillibrand from New York dropped out. And they're all white. Did anybody give a damn about them when they dropped out? And as far as this thing now being down to only a half a dozen or so white people, what stopped black politicians from throwing their hat into the ring? Deval Patrick, the former governor of Massachusetts, who's black, just joined the race. Michael Bloomberg just joined the race. Come on in, the water's fine. Nobody's stopping you from joining. And regarding the 6 or so that are whites who are likely to be on the next debate stage, there's no diversity. Mayor Pete is gay and his father's from Malta. Amy Klobuchar, her parents are from Slovenia. You've got Joe Biden, who's Catholic. You have Bernie Sanders, who's a Jew. So I'm trying to figure out what kind of diversity they want. What is their definition of diversity? If there isn't a black person, it's not diverse. Different religions, different ethnic backgrounds, that doesn't count. A different sexual orientation, that's not good enough. Unless there's a black person there, you don't have diversity. And these are Democrats who are voting in the primaries. So are you saying Democratic voters are racist and sexist? Because that's what Kamala Harris basically said. When she dropped out, she said, right before she dropped out, she said, the elephant in the room is there's never been anybody like me, meaning a black female, there's never been anybody like me. Well, she should talk to her constituents because these are Democrat voters who didn't like her. And by the way, she was once a top tier candidate. When she had her dust up with Tulsi Gabbard, she was asked why Tulsi Gabbard went after her. And she said, well, that's because I'm a top tier candidate. And by the polls, she was. She was also a black female then. So she's still a black female now that she's no longer a top tier candidate. The question is, why were you popular at one point and now you're not? And the answer is, look in the mirror, Kamala Harris. People did not find you relatable. I don't know why. But you can't call them racist when you were a top tier a little while ago and now you're not.
So who do you think can challenge the president?
Nobody. That's why Bloomberg got in. Bloomberg looked at this race, looked at these people, looked at Joe Biden, who doesn't know where he is half the time, apologizing for most of the things he stood for. He's supposed to be the moderate. He doesn't feel that any of these guys can win. That's why Deval Patrick jumped in. If people really thought that they had a viable candidate in that group of rivals, you wouldn't find Bloomberg, you wouldn't find Deval Patrick getting in.
I think Buttigieg is also being described as a moderate.
Ha! Yeah, Buttigieg is being described as a moderate. This is the guy who wants reparations. He calls it the Douglas Plan. He supports the Green New Deal. He supports a $15 minimum wage. He supports Medicare for all who want it as a pathway to Medicare for all. So ultimately he wants single payer. He just doesn't want to do it as quickly as his rivals do. That makes him a moderate. I guess they grade you on the curve.
So, Larry, there's something I wanted to talk about with you, and it's a difficult topic because there was this recent shooting in New Jersey, at the kosher market, right, and so forth. And so this, plays into this whole identity politics question. A number of people jumped in immediately after this shooting happened. It appeared there was anti-Semitic motive, people you didn't know, and there was, of course, white supremacy was thrown out there. Now we're seeing a bit of a different picture.
A big different picture.
Right. And it's just, there's this, what's with the knee-jerk to just jump to white supremacy every time?
Well, Joy Behar was on The View and when the story first broke, and she was talking to the former governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. And Joy Behar, when they talked about this taking place at a kosher market and the suggestion was that it might have been targeted, she suggested that this was a instance of white nationalism. I think that's the way she put it, white nationalists. Well, it turns out the two people who have been fingered for doing this are dead, are a black couple, and they belong to some anti-Semitic black group. The willingness on the part of Democrats to blame white males for everything is again in their DNA. It's Democrat politics 101. The Democrats have been saying for a long time that Donald Trump has caused a rise in white nationalism and a rise in racism. The numbers don't bear that out. There was just a study done by a couple of professors from the University of Pennsylvania who have been tracking 500 whites for a number of years, asking them their different opinions about different things. And the researchers admitted that they assumed because of Donald Trump that these whites would be far more likely to express anti-black and anti-Hispanic attitudes. In fact, they found the opposite. They were less likely to express them than they were before Donald Trump came into office. The peak in race relations, when you ask people, are race relations good or somewhat good, occurred during the administration of George W. Bush. 75% of whites thought that race relations were good or somewhat good, and 71% of blacks thought relations were good or somewhat good. Those numbers fell dramatically during the Obama administration. The numbers are not high now, but you don't find the same kind of drop-off as you found during the Obama administration.
Right.
And nobody talks about things Obama said and did that coarsen race relations in this country. And he did a lot of things that coarsen race relations. People talk about Donald Trump saying that there were good people on both sides. He never said that, but that's one of the arguments used to support the idea that Donald Trump has made race relations worse. If you want to do that, let's do that. How about when Obama said about the Cambridge Police Department, the Cambridge Police acted stupidly? Do you think that improved relationships between the police and the civilians? The Cambridge Police did not act stupidly, but Obama said that. The Obama administration embraced the Black Lives Matter movement. At least 3 black men murdered cops in Dallas, in Baton Rouge, and in New York, and posted on social media or told people that they did it because of their anger over the treatment of the blacks by police. One, I think, even specifically referred to Black Lives Matter movement as being a motivator. Well, the evidence does not show the kind of alleged institutional racism that Democrats keep talking about. The police chief in Dallas happened to be a black person. In Baltimore, where Freddie Gray died at the hands of the police, he was in a van and he died. The mayor is black. The majority of city council, black, all Democrats. The state attorney who brought the charges against the 6 officers is black. 3 of the officers black. The judge before whom 2 of the officers tried their case was black. And at the time, the U.S. Attorney General was black, and the President of the United States was black. So you have blacks running the whole institution in Baltimore, and still you're having people talk about institutional racism in Baltimore. It's ridiculous. And so the police are being unfairly targeted as being engaging in this kind of racism against black people. I'm not saying that there aren't racist cops. Obviously there are. But is there some sort of systemic kind of thing against black people, as you could argue with a straight face back in the 50s or the 60s? No. This is not your grandfather's police department. It's not your grandfather's country. But black people are still told this crap over and over again by Democrats in order to get them angry, so they go in and pull that lever for the Democratic Party. Because after all, the Democratic Party wears the white hat, Republicans are racist, they wear the black hat. 81% of Democrats believe Donald Trump is racist. I mean, best economy ever for black people. He did prison reform. There have been 1,000 inmates who've taken advantage of the First Step Act to allow people to have their prison sentences examined. And this 1,000 people have had their sentences reduced by an average of 70 months. 90% of the beneficiaries have been black men. Donald Trump's also been expanding so-called enterprise zones. He also supports choice in school, something that urban parents want, but that white Democrats do not. So if he is a racist, he's a bad one.
Well, and what about anti-Semitism? Because that's the question certainly on my mind, and over the last year I've been hearing a lot more accounts about how it's sort of something that's underrepresented.
Right. Democrats have argued that white nationalism is on the rise because there's been an uptick in reporting of hate crimes committed by whites. It turns out that 1,000 precincts never reported anything. And they were approached by the administration to now start reporting. So it's unclear whether or not there's just sort of an aberration or whether or not there's a real trend. We don't really know yet. But there certainly does appear to be an increase in hate crimes against Jews, especially in New York, especially in an area called Crown Heights where a lot of Orthodox Jews live.
Right. A
regular guest on my show is a guy named Dov Hikind, who happens to be a Democrat, and he was in the New York legislature for 28 years. And he says there's no question that it's rising, and very few people want to talk about it because many of the perps are black. And the Democratic Party does not want to anger anybody by suggesting that there's a problem in the black community with anti-Semitism, but there's a problem in the black community with respect to anti-Semitism. The Anti-Defamation League commissioned a poll some years ago, and they found out that anti-Semitism in America was at an all-time low, around 12%. And I said at the time when I was giving a speech, don't expect that to get down much lower because around 10% of Americans believe Elvis is still alive, and about 8% believe if you send him a letter, he'll get it. So there might be 2% you can work on. Outside of that, don't expect it to go much lower. But in the black community, anti-Semitism was 3 times the rate of non-black Gentiles. Around 36% of blacks could be called anti-Semitic. And I was asked why. And the answer is just wholesale ignorance. Most black people are unaware of how close Jews have been to and for blacks. There's a guy named Julius Rosenwald who worked with Booker T. Washington to build some 5,000 schools in the South. At one point, 1 out of every 4 kids in the South was being educated in a Rosenwald school. A Jew helped to co-found the NAACP. The state of Israel airlifted 15,000 Ethiopian Jews who were facing famine and persecution in the mid-60s, mid-80s, and the early 90s. Airlifted them to Israel, where they live today. Of the people that went down to the South to protest against segregation, there was a project in 1961 where about 400 whites got on buses and challenged the segregation facilities for public transportation. 200 whites, 200 blacks. Of the whites, the majority of them were Jewish. There's a movie called Mississippi Burning that was sparked because of an actual triple homicide in Mississippi in 1964, in Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 3 people were murdered who were civil rights workers. One was a man named Cheney, he was black. One was a man named Schwerner, a Jew. Another was a man named Goodman, a Jew. There's a magazine called Emerge. Emerge was an angry black magazine.
Okay.
It's no longer around. But they commissioned a poll to ask various ethnic groups and racial groups in America how you feel about black people. Are blacks dumb? Are blacks lazy? Are blacks more inclined to complain? Are blacks more inclined to go on welfare? Of the groups that were least likely to say yes to any of those, Jews. Blacks were more likely to say yes to those things than Jews were. So of all the ethnic groups in this country, racial groups, ethnic groups in this country, Jews are the least likely to have negative attitudes and prejudice towards black people. Yet 3 times as many blacks are anti-Semitic as non-blacks. It's crazy, it's insane. Jews have been so instrumental in helping black people. There's a man named Jack Greenberg who is a lawyer. He worked side by side with Thurgood Marshall, the guy that spearheaded the Brown versus Board of Education case that was won unanimously in the Supreme Court. Jack Greenberg is one of his right-hand men. And ironically, when Jack Greenberg applied to teach a course at Harvard on civil rights, Harvard Law School, the student protested because they wanted a black person to teach it. Never mind, he working side by side with Thurgood Marshall. Many blacks are completely unaware of the contribution Jews have made to the civil rights and of the support that Jews have given black people over the years.
Fascinating.
And you have arguably the 2 leading anti-Semites in the nation are both black, Louis Farrakhan and Al Sharpton. In the case of Louis Farrakhan, this guy has referred to Judaism as a gutter religion. He's praised Hitler. And he recently said, I'm not anti-Semite, I'm anti-termite. What the hell is that? And Al Sharpton referred to Jews as diamond merchants and criticized them for moving into areas in New York. Al Sharpton was right in the middle of the Crown Heights riots that took place in 1991, several days of riots between blacks and Jews were the victim, blacks were the perpetrators. There was a New York Times reporter who was covering it, and he said, my paper wants me to cover this as if it's an even-handed kind of thing. I haven't seen a single instance where a Jew has gone after a black person. I've only seen it the other way around. And he went public and said he's being pressured to basically fabricate a narrative that the violence was going both ways, when in fact it wasn't. And Al Sharpton was right in the thick of that. And Al Sharpton said publicly, if the Jews want to get it on, tell them to pin their yarmulkes and come over to my house and we'll get it on. Al Sharpton also turned a dispute between a Jewish tenant and a black subtenant into a racial thing. If you look up Freddie's Fashion Mart, the rhetoric of Al Sharpton so provoked a man to go into Freddie's Fashion Mart with a gun. He set it on fire, shot up a bunch of people, and shot himself up. I'm not saying Al Sharpton should be blamed for it, but certainly the atmosphere that he helped to create set the conditions for this black guy to do that. And yet Al Sharpton is a kingmaker in the Democratic Party, arguably has more power now than he's had ever in his career. All of these major candidates have gone to New York and kissed his ring to try to get his endorsement. And here this guy is making all these kinds of statements about Jews. And in the case of Farrakhan has not been denounced by the Congressional Black Caucus. You'll find all sorts of photographs of him with members of the Congressional Black Caucus. There's a photograph of Minister Farrakhan with then Senator Barack Obama. A photograph that did not surface until after Obama left office. I wonder why. And Alan Dershowitz said that had he seen that photograph of Senator Obama with Minister Farrakhan, he never would have voted for Obama. So You tell me what's going on. Why Farrakhan has not been condemned, why Al Sharpton has not been condemned, is beyond me by the party that purports to be the party of anti-Semitism, anti-racism, and anti-discrimination. You tell me.
Or anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism, right.
So what I'm getting from what you just said is that identity politics actually plays a role in the underreporting of acts of anti-Semitism in the community, Jess.
The underreporting is for lots of reasons. But the basic reason is that the media would not want to highlight the fact that by and large, the hate crimes committed against Jews have been committed by black people, especially in New York, because that would then be perceived as blaming the victim. They don't want to do that. There was a poll taken by Rasmussen some years ago.
Okay.
Blacks, Hispanics, and whites were asked, of these three groups, which one is the most racist? Whites said blacks. Hispanics said blacks. Blacks said blacks. But no one wants to talk about that. It is a real problem in this country. The anti-Semitism is a real problem on the part of blacks in this country. And when I talked to the Democratic politician I mentioned, who was in the legislature for 28 years, I asked him why there was such underreporting. And he agreed with me that there was underreporting because the media did not want to shed light on bad behavior on the part of black people. The media often acts as if they are a public relations bureau for blacks. And that's why the media runs with these broad themes of racism being a major problem in America, when in fact it's not. Themes of sexism. You often hear people in the media say that women make 80 cents on the dollar for doing the very same work that men do. How absurd is that? You're running a company and you can fire all the men, hire women, pay them 80 cents on the dollar and pocket the difference? Who wouldn't do that? It's absurd, but it's a mantra that you hear over and over and over again. And in the case of racism, it's getting people killed. Because what you're doing is encouraging young black men, when they're confronted by the police, to be on guard and to assume that the person is going to do them harm. As opposed to telling black people, look, most of these high-profile cases would have ended differently if the suspect had simply cooperated, had simply done what the officer says. This is what so-called black leaders should be telling young black people to do. Instead, they're talking about institutional racism, systemic racism, and structural racism, and making people, therefore, escalate when they're having an encounter with the police. These things have all been studied. And it turns out that the police are less likely to use deadly force against a black suspect than a white suspect. There's an economist named Roland Fryer, who's black. He is a professor at Harvard. He did a study on whether or not the police were disproportionately using deadly force against black people. And he assumed that he was going to find that they were. And he said, right, the findings were the most shocking of my career. Not only did I not find that the police were disproportionately using deadly force against blacks, but they were less likely to use deadly force against blacks and against Hispanics, probably because they feared being accused of racism, feared becoming a public bad guy,
right.
And that result has been replicated by other studies as well. So it's just the opposite of what people think. And when you look at frequent encounters of the police, about 1.5 blacks have had 3 or more encounters with the police in a given year. 1.2 whites have, so it's not much of a difference. And there's something called the public contact survey that the DOJ does every 2 years, where they ask about 60,000 people, have you had a contact with the police in the last year? If the answer is yes, how was your contact? Did anybody say anything? Give me your race, give me your sex, give me everything. And they've been doing this for years. They can't find any pattern at all of abuse based upon race against black people. Can't find it. It's not there. It's not like they haven't looked for it. It's simply not there. But that's the opposite of what the Democrats are telling black people. That's the opposite of what the media is telling black people. And that's the opposite of what a lot of black people think.
So, speaking of what black people think, I noticed there's been these recent polls, and like multiple polls that show, significant increase in black appreciation of the president. I think I saw something in the realm of 1/3, and there were a series of polls that were showing that.
That's seismic.
It It appears to be, although I have also seen something that suggested that there were these kinds of numbers before, but they didn't translate into voting in 2018, I guess. I can't remember the exact timing. But what do you make of all this?
Well, what I'm hoping is that there's going to be an awakening. Candace Owens refers to it as Blexit. Because of the low unemployment for blacks, best numbers in history, because of what President Trump has done with prison reform, because of President Trump's support for choice in school, I think a lot of black people are rethinking their allegiance to the Democratic Party. And you're right, I have seen polls that put the support at 34%. I saw one that puts the support for Donald Trump on the part of blacks at 34.5%. Even the NAACP several months ago had a poll, and they put it at 21%. Even if it's 21%, that is 3 times what Trump got in 2016 when he got around between 7 and 8% of the black vote. To put it at 21% means he'll have the highest black vote since Gerald Ford in 1976. And at 35%, that would be seismic. That would be epic. And Democrats probably are scared to death that Donald Trump has been making inroads into the black community. Imagine how well he'd be doing if he wasn't called a racist every third day.
Any final words, Larry?
I think that this whole impeachment drive is going to backfire. I think Nancy Pelosi's instincts were correct when she tried to warn her caucus not to go down this route. She was pressured to do so. I think the numbers are showing that in the swing states, support for impeachment is declining. Support for the president is increasing. I think we're going to be very surprised at the substantial black vote he gets. And it's going to be 4 more years. But they're not going to stop. Al Green has already said, the Democrat from Texas, if we don't get him this time, the president can be impeached more than once. You don't have to just stop at one impeachment. So they're going to keep going because they've got what I call Trump derangement syndrome. What has this man done that's been so bad? He came into office and said same-sex marriage is settled law. No president's ever said that, which means he had a more progressive position on same-sex marriage than Obama did when he came into office. Economy is doing great. People's 401ks are doing well. Are we worse off in the world in terms of foreign policy? He moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, something that Obama said he would do, didn't do, something that George W. Bush said he would do, didn't do. And has there been a conflagration? We were told that if that happens, the Middle East is going to blow up. It hasn't. So where in the world are things worse off? He pulled out of the Iran deal. What's happened? The Iran economy is collapsing, and Iran now might be crawling back to do some sort of deal because they're in serious trouble. We were told if he pulled out of this deal, the world was going to go to hell in a handbasket. It hasn't done so. He's gotten NATO to pony up far more money. Obama and George W. Bush both complained that the NATO countries were not putting roughly 2% or so of their GDP into the kitty, and Donald Trump has gotten them all to pony up far more money, something that, again, presidents in the past have complained about. So I told you that racism is not worse because of Trump. There might be an aberration in reporting of hate crimes, but it doesn't appear that there's any kind of wholesale change. So I'm trying to figure out how the country is worse off because President Trump has been in office and why he's so hated. He publicly said he wants mandatory medical and family leave. Name a Republican who's ever said anything like that. I was in Ohio during the acceptance speech, and I saw Ivanka Trump talk about medical and family leave. I heard Donald Trump talk about it. This is something Democrats have wanted. So this is arguably the least conservative Republican president on social issues we've had in a very long period of time. And you guys still hate his guts. But they've always hated Republicans. Ronald Reagan was called a racist. George Herbert Walker Bush was called a racist by Maxine Waters. And George W. Bush, of course, was called a racist. So they're all called racists, but this is on a whole nother level I've never seen. That's why I believe that much of the country is afflicted with Trump derangement syndrome. The good news is it's covered under Obamacare.
Larry Elder, such a pleasure to have you.
My pleasure.